Good evening and welcome to Amplify, a telephone talk show that looks at life from a religious perspective. I'm Father Ron Lengwin, hoping you have felt the warmth of God's love in your life this day, but especially the joy you will feel when you share God's love with others. As we do each week, I'd like to begin a program with a story that is based on faith and formed with imagination. I always hope it's a way of introducing our topic for the night. Jesus sat with his disciples, but did not partake of the meal they were eating. It was John who said, "Master, you have not eaten with us. Are you sick?" Jesus answered, "No, I must spend some time alone. I must go away for a while, and I will return when the sun has risen." Peter responded, "Master, let me go with you." Jesus replied, "Peter, you truly are my friend, but this is something I must do alone." You could tell by their faces the other disciples were also concerned. They had not only been with Jesus for a short time and did not yet understand his ways. Peter said, "Master, I know I am the most inquisitive and boldest one among us." The others began to laugh in agreement with Peter. Jesus said, "He certainly is. He is not afraid to speak his mind." Peter let his comment pass, but Jesus asked, "Master, where are you going? And what are you going to do because you have not eaten?" Jesus answered, "If you really want to know, I will tell you. Man does not live by bread alone. There is more to life than eating with friends." Then Jesus looked down at the earth and at the glowing fire and said, "Spending time in prayer and fasting can be likened to a fire within us that keeps us warm. Our hearts and minds emit a beautiful glow to the Heavenly Father, like a light in the darkness, like a star in the night. It is a nice, warm feeling. I tell you this, taking only bread and water for a day will not harm you. It will help you to grow spiritually. And if you do it prayerfully, you can become one with yourself, with creation, and with the heavens." Jesus looked down again at the fire, picked up a twig, and stoked it. Sparks flew into the air, and he said, "See, in doing this, you will also encourage others." His disciples looked at one another and asked, "Master, may we also participate in this spiritual feast?" Jesus' face was filled with a beautiful glow as a tear fell slowly from his eye and said, "I am pleased by your request, and I'm sure my Heavenly Father is overjoyed. But remember the joy that must be felt in your heart. It is good to be silent and to spend time thinking only about the Heavenly Father." The men were lost in their own thoughts, but they smiled at one another. Jesus looked at the glowing fire with great satisfaction, because he now knew these men were truly chosen. Our guest this evening writes in the introduction to his book titled Choosing Presence, and that's why I told this opening story, that even Jesus had to spend time away from his disciples, his apostles, so that he could be with the Father. Choosing presence, how to access God's peace and release fear, anxiety, and stress. And again, our author writes, "Imagine we had a group of 10 people in a circle, and each of us was going to write down what we think is the most challenging issue in our lives. In other words, we were going to talk about our inner fears, our inner pain. Each of us would have a different story to tell, but though there may be 10 different stories in our circle, at the core, each story is really about one central issue going on inside of us: inner negativity. Stress, anxiety, worry, lack of self-esteem, all of these are caused by things happening in each of our different life situations. And unfortunately, what too many of us fail to realize is that we ourselves are creating this inner negativity. It's not our individual circumstances or stories, but how we react to them in our unconscious mind that creates pain. The practice of presence allows us to see clearly what the real problem is. It is personal, and it is simple to do because the power of the practice of presence isn't what we do, but what is being done to us when we stop the inner negative dialogue and experience our vibrant inner life, which is accessible to each of us always. That is God's promise to each of us, and he quotes Psalm 46, "Be still and know that I am God." Jim Heaney has been teaching in the practice of presence from a Christian perspective for over 20 years, encouraging people of all ages to incorporate this particular practice into all areas of their lives, professional, relationships, sports, arts, health, and even more for greater spiritual and physical well-being. He's the founder of Electronic Waveform Labs, manufacturer of the H-Wave device, which is the primary modality in the drug-free treatment of chronic pain. Jim lives with his wife, Patricia, in Huntington Beach, California. Jim Heaney, welcome to Amplify. How nice to have you.
Oh, thank you very much, Father Ron.
Why don't you first of all say just a little bit more about what is meant by presence, choosing presence?
When we say choosing presence, at the core of it, or the foundation of presence, is the unmistakable experience of God's spiritual energy when we become consciously present with the right intention. And it is the motivating factor that keeps us coming back to the practice of presence. And presence is not a permanent state because there's too many distractions in each of our lives for it to be a permanent state. But it's a state through God's gift to us. It's a state we can keep coming back to throughout the day over and over again and be renewed by God's spiritual energy. That is the core of it.
And you write that it enhances every spiritual practice we already do. And
Absolutely.
So it sounds like it has its own meaning and own power, but kind of a catalyst. And in this book, you're going to show us how to do this, how to practice the spiritual practice. Is there a common obstacle or challenge to practicing this kind of presence?
Well, the common obstacle is each of us, no matter who it is, there's always a resistance to change. And once we realize how powerful the peace and the power of the present moment is through the practice of presence, doing it properly, that resistance just starts to diminish to where we realize we truly do have a choice. We have access to God's spiritual energy anytime throughout the day if we stop all the inner negative dialogue.
And you've been practicing it for a while, and the thing that touched me the deepest part is that it allows God to change us from the inside. We tend to think of our religious practices, our spiritual practices in that way, but we have to live our way, you write, into a new way of being, not just thinking.
Yes, absolutely. I'll give you an example. What it does, it answers three very important questions for each of us. As we practice presence on a daily basis, the first question it answers for us is, why am I at peace? And through the practice of presence, we know why we're at peace. We're at peace because we have made a conscious intention to connect with God's spiritual energy by becoming still within. Now, it also lets us know when we feel not at peace, when we do have inner unease or even sometimes inner chaos, and we know The only reason we are not at peace was we have allowed our unconscious mind, our negative ego, which is insecure and fear-filled, to direct us through unconsciousness. Meaning, when I say unconsciousness, what I'm talking about is we're here physically, but our mind is thinking or obsessing about something that did happen, or thinking or obsessing about something that might happen. It simply is not reality. And the practice of presence makes that very clear to us. And once that becomes obvious, we know we have a choice. And the third is, how do we get back to peace? And that's exactly what we've been practicing. Just as we know how we were at peace in the first place, we know the distractions have taken us out of peace, and we know exactly how to get back to peace. And God's peace is always available in this moment, because God is always available in this moment. As Christians, we believe God reveals himself in our daily life, and that is absolutely true. But what we have to remember is God is only in the present moment. He's not in the past, and he's not in the future. He's only here now. And by the practice of presence, what it truly does for us, it humbles us daily, because we realize that we cannot change ourselves from the inside without connecting with God's Spirit. And we cannot connect with God's Spirit unless we bring in stillness, as he told us to. Be still and know that I am God.
So it is a very simple and yet profound concept, and you have learned that love is primary in our lives. You write, we can't have random moments of stillness and expect God to change our lives. It has to be a daily relationship with God from when we wake up in the morning until we go to sleep at night, because it enhances every single aspect of our life. The practice of presence, you write, puts us in the exact space where God's love resides. It lives in this moment in stillness. And so there's a sense in which presence is a cure, isn't it?
Yes, and that's what makes it so profound. You know, before I started actually meditating about 23 years ago, and without a doubt, it significantly improved my life and practicing presence. But I was practicing presence more in my head, not in my heart. And about 15 years ago, I made the conscious decision to make presence primary in my life. And when I did that, it completely changed every aspect of my life, because it made every aspect of my life better. As I became more humble through the power and the peace of the present moment, I realized that humility was truly my strength, or rather, It was God's strength working through me. And that's his gift. And each of us have experienced it. If any of us said this to ourselves, those moments, let's say we saw a beautiful sunset and it just stopped us in our tracks, and everything, we became automatically still. And we just felt the sense, we felt a vibrant inner life. Or we could be in nature and have that same experience. See, but it wasn't the sunset or nature that made us feel that sense of peace and calm and love. It was the stillness. That just made it, those experiences made it easier for us to become still inside. So we have the choice and the gift from God to bring in stillness no matter where we are, what the circumstances of our life is. He never abandons us. He's always in the present moment.
Right. And some of those circumstances are filled with pain and suffering. You write that your life has not been without struggle, and certainly my life has not been without struggle. I think that's true of each and every one of us. It's part of the human condition. And so you write that it's the answer to our inner suffering. Tell us a little bit about Brother Lawrence, who was a 17th century Carmelite monk who wrote a lot about the practice of the presence of God.
Yeah, he was a saint. He was such a simple man. Okay. I just talk about suffering. Suffering, when we suffer without connection to God's spirit within us, we feel alone and isolated, which exacerbates the suffering. But as we practice presence, we are going to have those difficult times. But there's always going to be a sense of God's peace around that suffering. That's his gift to us. And Brother Lawrence, so profound and so simple. He says, all we have to do is recognize God as being intimately present within us. And when I first read Brother Lawrence about 10 years ago, when we were finishing up the book, the editor who was working with me said, look, you have to write something about Brother Lawrence. So I went back and I read the book again. And what I realized reading it 10 years later and being more present was that everything that I wrote in the book, he said in different words, but he meant the same thing. He talked about unconsciousness. Yes. I think he refers to it as turning our back on God. Okay. And he
Jim,
talked
let me break in there because we need to take this break. Hold your thought when we come back, and then let's pick up about the unconscious aspect of this. Welcome back to Amplify, where our guest this evening is Jim Heaney. We're talking about his book, Choosing Presence, How to Access God's Peace and Release Fear, Anxiety, and Stress. And when we took our break, he was talking to us about Brother Lawrence, who is a 17th century Carmelite monk, and we wouldn't even be thinking about the practice of presence, Jim tells us. And he's trying to get more people to do what he did, to develop a constant awareness of God's presence through his spiritual energy in our lives. So, Jim, I cut you off in mid-sentence.
Okay, yes. And well, one thing, Brother Lawrence, one of the things he says is to be constantly aware of God's presence. And to be constantly aware of God's presence, we have to talk to him throughout the day. And that's where we come in with taking our 3 conscious breaths every hour to ground us in the present moment. And what it does, what we call inner conditions ourselves, because we're conditioned to compulsive thinking, repetitive thinking, and what that does, it puts us in an unconscious state. And that unconscious state, that space of unconsciousness, is where we create all our inner fears and our inner conflicts. A good example of that is if we asked any of us, if we asked ourselves the times when we were full of anxiety and worry and our lack of esteem was low, and we asked ourselves, am I present right now in this moment? The answer 100% of the time would be no. And at the same time, if we asked ourselves those times when we felt a sense of peace, calm, connectedness, free inside, and we asked ourselves, am I present in this moment right now? The answer 100% of the time would be yes. So that is the core. That's where it all starts, in an unconscious state, for one simple reason. When we are unconscious, we are not in reality. It is our negative ego, which is in opposition to what is real.
As you write, as humans, we all want the same 3 things. We want to feel good about ourselves. We want high self-esteem. We want to have meaning in our lives. We want to be loved. But you write, the problem is that our ego sends us outside ourselves to find these things when we should be looking within. And you talk about the role of emotions. The most pervasive is fear, and I believe that that's one of Lucifer's greatest powers. Fear. I think he works off of fear.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Every, all of, whatever all of us want deeply for ourselves, it can only be found through stillness, because stillness is the gateway to spirit, and God is spirit. And it's only his power that changes us from the inside. Because fear is all started or created in our head in an unconscious state. And it's always in the future. It has no foundation. It's not real now. And that's why we cannot deal with it, because we're dealing with something that is absolutely false. It's our false self.
And so, um, uh, before I jump over to stillness, you've been talking about, just to close, meeting God in the moment, getting out of our heads and into our hearts to connect with the Spirit. We are able to have a personal relationship with God. God is our teacher. You write about the role of humility and where it is that we can find God in our lives. And you write that. When we find God when we consciously come into the present moment, and it is in this place of stillness where we grow in our relationship with God's Spirit, just as you have begun to talk about the whole concept of stillness and how important it is for us to think about. And you write about it that it is what we experience when we break the negative cycle of unconscious thought, emotion, and reaction that derives from living in the past or fearing the future, and come into the peace of the present moment.
Absolutely. And what it is when we bring in stillness, we have a true perspective of reality now. We know that all the fears that we have, the anxieties we have, is always outside the present moment. And once we inner condition ourselves to where it's almost an automatic reaction from us to reject negativity, inner negativity, when we know we have a choice. And the stillness is the gateway. It is the gateway to spirit. And
Yes.
that is the power. That's where, and the present moment, it truly is a power. There is no other way that we could stop the inner negativity without bringing in stillness, stopping all the inner negative dialogue, and then experiencing that realization in our lives over and over again throughout the day.
Yes. And when we, the point, these statistics make your point. For many of us, you write, senseless activity is going on in our unconscious mind every day. Several years ago, the National Science Foundation reported that the average person has an estimated 12 to 60,000 thoughts per day. Some experts
Yes.
estimate even more. And of those thoughts, 80% are negative. If you use 60,000 as your base, that's 48,000 negative thoughts generating stress, anxiety, inner conflicts, and fears every day. That certainly makes the case for choosing presence, doesn't it?
Yes, absolutely. And to add to that, when we talk, there's a study done on worry, and I believe from Cornell University, and 85% of all the worries we have never happen,
Mm.
which I found amazing. That's an amazing statistic. Yet we suffer for 100% of our worries, and they're the main cause of our inner fears and conflicts. Carl Jung, obviously the world famous, he's dead now, but world famous psychiatrist and psychologist, he said the two most important aspects of his work were spiritual and numinous experiences, because they had the power to heal his patients. And it made him believe that there was a divine power in the universe. And this is the number one person in mental health in the history of psychiatry.
And you point out that senseless activity makes us powerless. At any moment in the day, we have a choice between inner chaos or inner peace. Is there then a relationship between stillness and silence?
And silence?
Yes.
Oh, absolutely. Except stillness, what makes, when we say practice presence, the only difference though is this. Are they similar? Sure. But the difference is when we practice presence, it's always with one intention. And that intention is to connect with God's spiritual energy. It's like St. James says, if we pray to God in two minds, don't expect anything from God. And he says a man in two minds is like the waves in the ocean that gets pushed back and forth by the wind. That man is unstable. And that's what we are in an unconscious state. So presence, when we practice presence with the right intention, that is what is the gateway to God's spiritual energy. We have to ask.
Why is it that some people fear being alone with God, or on the other hand, don't even believe that's possible?
And the reason they don't believe it's possible is, quite frankly, me 30 years ago. I didn't think it was possible.
Yes.
You can't believe something only through reading about it. You have to experience. That's why God said, I think a big miss that we have is we hear so often Psalm 46:10, be still and know that I am God. And I think most of us think that was a suggestion by God. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command. God wants us free. The only way we can be free if we don't enslave ourselves with unconscious negativity brought about by compulsive, repetitive thinking that has nothing to do with reality now. Mm-hmm. That's where all our fears, our inner fears, are created.
It sounds like a meditation might be a form of stillness.
Yes. The difference is certainly the practice of presence is a form of meditation, but it's a meditation. If you ask 10 people why they meditate, you're probably going to get almost 10 different answers. And meditation certainly is beneficial. But the practice of presence is only about one intention, connecting with God's spiritual energy. He teaches us through the peace that he gives us when we are consciously present in this moment with the right intention. And that's what makes it so powerful. It's exactly what God told us to do.
And this is where I've thought a lot about this one particular part of your book, many parts of the books, but this one, you write, well, none of us is worthy or holy. Our worthiness or holiness simply doesn't matter to God. And then you have spiritual writer Paula Darcy captures this modern go-go mentality in a tongue-in-cheek checklist titled Guaranteed Ways to Miss the Hidden God, How to Make Mistakes and Miss the Voice Within. Let me just touch on the 10 of them, not speaking fully about them. Live your life at high speed. Stay
Mm.
scattered and distracted. Take everything personally. Use blame liberating. Don't laugh, especially at yourself. Stay tied to your past. Use the word because. Never question or think for yourself. Continue to think of God as invisible and distant. Reinforce the belief that your life is going to happen soon. This is not it, not yet, but one day, maybe when I'm finished reading. So, it goes into a lot more description than just what I read, but it's almost like you find yourself in some of these things that you shouldn't
Oh,
be doing.
that describes me 30 years ago.
Yes, right, sure.
That's basically me 30 years ago, yes. And just look at our society. How, I work in jail ministry. I worked in jail ministry for the last over 20 years. And also we work Catholic worker, feeding the homeless, and also Colette Children's Home, housing the homeless. And naturally, ministry is not church. But, I've talked to a lot of people, and I also talked to wealthy businessmen, okay? I talked to, obviously, prisoners. I talked to working people, talked to executives. Everyone, the questions they have, their unconscious fears are basically all the same. It doesn't matter their station in life. So we're all in the same boat. And what we have to remember, I think, is that none of us have the power to fix ourselves within. It has to be a power beyond us that is working through us. And it simply can't be done without God's spiritual energy. It doesn't work.
Yeah, I underline a good the good books are that I underline. It's almost like I'm learning something completely new, and I might underline almost the whole book. Just a couple of things that I underline while we're talking about stillness, simply doing what God told us to do. You're right. Some of us already begin our day in stillness through meditation or prayer, but then we spend the rest of the day and evening without consciously bringing stillness into our life. That absence of stillness allows the stress and anxiety to build and our mind to start spinning, draining us of energy. And a little later, creating stillness is as easy as taking 3 conscious breaths in a row to access God's spiritual energy and doing this throughout the day. After starting our day with a practice of presence, it is the most important spiritual practice we can do. Say a little more about this practice.
Oh, absolutely. It's like I said, I've been meditating for roughly 23 years. And I said 15 years ago, I made presence primary in my life, meaning the benefits of meditation was obvious from the beginning. But when I made presence primary in my life, it changed everything. I never thought possible to have access to God's peace throughout the day, but you have to do it throughout the day, meaning every hour. You have to ground yourself in the present moment. And that's why we made the free app, practicing presence a Christian way. And the reason is, if we follow the simple practice of presence and we get an hourly reminder on the app, I can say this: the first day a person actually practices presence as it's outlined. By the way, when I say practice, I'm practicing presence the way God told us to practice presence, bringing in stillness. It's not something that I myself came up with. I'm just following God's orders, God's command. But when we do it, the very first day we do it, we will say to ourselves, this definitely was a better day than yesterday. Mm-hmm. And after we do it for a month, we'll say, wow, this works. After we do it for 3 months, we know how powerful it is. And I doubt if any of us do it for 3 months, we'll go back to the way we lived before, because we know now we truly have a choice. We do not have to accept anxiety, stress, worry, lack of self-esteem. That's all created in an unconscious state. And if we know, answer those same 3 questions I talked to earlier. Why am I present? Why am I not present? And how do I get back to presence?
Right.
That's God's gift to us. We cannot do it ourselves. It's what's being done to us when we bring in stillness.
Let me almost take us out to our next break. If I were to ask you a question now, I'd be cutting you off in mid-sentence again. You have this quote from Henry Nouwen, who says, quote, "To gently push aside and silence the many voices that question my goodness, and to trust that I will hear the voice of blessing, that demands real effort." Close quote. And then you respond to that by stating, if we say it's too hard or don't have time, what we're really saying is that we don't have time to allow God to stop our suffering. We don't allow God the time to stop our suffering. Creating stillness demands real effort, but we create space more and more throughout the day and intercondition ourselves. It becomes easier and easier until it becomes effortless. And again, those 3 breaths in a row, that breathing can become a very powerful spiritual experience. And when we think about it, that's really pretty simple, that breath is spirit. We're about halfway through the book, and if you're just joining us now, here's what he writes at this point. What have we learned so far? This kind of a summary, what we talked about, not completely, but mostly during the first part of our program. What have we learned so far? We know that our inner conflicts and fears stem from our ego, our unconscious mind. The negative dialogue it generates is fixated on something that happened in the past or something we anticipate happening in the future. It keeps us from encountering God in the present moment because our minds and hearts are somewhere else. And I'm just going to skip around now, here and there. In God's presence, he writes, we are able to see what's real, and that frees us from our suffering. God is present. God is in the present moment. Therefore, stillness connects us to the love, energy, and power of God's Spirit within us. Presence is first and foremost a spiritual practice. And just one more section here. In my experience, he writes, there isn't a spiritual practice simpler or more powerful than practicing presence. Presence is a spiritual practice that we can do every day, many times throughout the day, to ground ourselves in the moment. Anyone can do it because its foundation is in the breath. Say just a little bit more about the foundation in the breath, Jim.
Yeah, what's so powerful about, as I say, the breath is, as we know, breath is spirit. And it's the simplest yet the most profound way to stop the inner dialogue going on inside of us. Now, it's sort of, look, we could take 3 breaths, biological breaths, and hey, they may give us some relief. But when we take 3 conscious breaths with the intention of connecting with God's spiritual energy, it becomes a very powerful spiritual practice. Number one, because it's what God told us to do. And as we experience that power, what we realize is we simply do not have to accept anxiety, worry, or fear. Because it's not our power that is diminishing it. It's God's spiritual energy changing us from the inside,
Mm-hmm.
taking us to a true perspective of reality at this moment. And that's how God teaches us, through the peace that flows through the present moment.
In your chapter on inner conditioning, you write about building our foundation on rock, that human beings are creatures of habit. You don't have to be a scientist to know that we're forming a habit of being aware of how we feel inside, and that when we practice presence, you write, we know the path out of suffering, and it is our choice whether or not to follow that path. Fear is always in the future. Inner freedom and peace are always now. And you point out that there are many times in the course of life that we need to work our way back to peace. Tell us a bit about the interplay that you refer to as contrast and choice.
Yes, it's like what's, again, so powerful about the practice of presence is, as we practice it, we become very conscious, very aware of how we feel inside. So when we say contrast, what we're saying is, am I going to accept how I feel when I am unconscious, living through memory or anticipation, creating inner anxiety and fears? Or am I going to accept the peace that's always in the present moment? But we're not going to get to that point unless we do it consistently. And that is when we inner condition ourselves. And I might say this. See, initially, it probably takes about 3 weeks to get in the habit of doing the morning practice and
Mm-hmm.
taking those 3 conscious breaths throughout the day. But I'll tell you what, once you do it for 3 months, 6 months, I would say what's going to happen, like happened to me, I breathe throughout the day, I don't know how many times. And not because I'm feeling bad, because I want to continue to feel this inner freedom, continue to experience reality now, not allowing myself, and all of us have the same choice, to build up any unease, which eventually turns into inner chaos.
Yes.
Again, it is the power and the peace of the present moment, and it truly is the most powerful gift God has given us. It's His presence always.
And it's your belief that our body can alert us when we're slipping out of reality because God's grace is at work.
Yes, absolutely. And again, it's not what we're doing, it's what's being done to us as we bring in stillness. And our body truly alerts us because we know what we're looking for.
Mm-hmm.
If we don't do it consistently, we're not going to know what we're looking for. And it's like, sometimes people say, well, I don't really have time. I don't have time to do that. Wait a second. We actually don't have time not to do it. Because if we don't do it, we're basically allowing ourselves to be taken over every day with inner negativity that we create in an unconscious state. And we truly are not taking the choice that God gave us. And it's simple. It's literally, as I say, it literally becomes effortless.
And we have to understand, as you point out in the book, that God isn't just out there somewhere, but God is within us every day.
Oh, absolutely. And it's beyond a shadow of a doubt, we know that as we become consciously present, there's a power beyond us that is working through us as we become still inside. And just don't happen in your morning practice. Throughout the day, it also happens. Now, there's different levels of presence, but guess what? Every level is excellent compared to being unconscious.
In fact, you're right that too often spiritual seekers fall into the trap of trying to think their way to inner peace. They think that the secret lies with someone else, a spiritual teacher or other holy person, and that if they simply study with them long enough, they'll learn the answer to inner peace from them. But basically, you say we have been taught to figure out God in our heads rather than experience God in our being. So the first action is getting to the place where God is in the present, but too many of us don't believe that it's possible, you write, to have that personal relationship with God. And again, don't believe that God's out there somewhere and don't realize that he's really within us.
Absolutely. And he proves that to us every single day as we become more present, as we inner condition ourselves more, as we grow in inner confidence. And he never leaves the present moment. Only we leave the present moment. And we can't think our way into presence, but we can and do think our way into anxiety, worry, stress, and lack of self-esteem. We do that all the time. And once we realize we have a choice, it's the beginning of the end of self-created inner negativity.
And it comes back to those three questions. Am I at peace now, and do I know why? If I am not at peace, do I know why? And most important, if I am not at peace, do I know how to get back to peace? And you write that if we can answer those three questions through our own experience, nothing else matters. We are free.
Exactly.
We've allowed God's Spirit through the peace of the present moment to free us, and we spend every day proving that again and again to ourselves through the practice of presence, and that's why we're never going back to the way we lived before.
That's exactly correct. Think about it. If we look at that and we go, wait a second, if I know why I'm at peace, and I know why I'm not at peace, and I know how to get back to peace, it's God teaching us and changing our lives from the inside. That's exactly what it is.
You write about resistance being our main obstacle to peace. Tell us a little bit, what is resistance, and how can the practice of presence stop it?
Resistance is accepting. When we refuse to accept what is, we are accepting what is not. And that's the heart of resistance. In other words, we know, let's say we're practicing presence. We know that when we practice presence, our day is better. Every aspect of our life is better. But what happens to people is they feel so good, and then all of a sudden, well, it's on autopilot. No, it's not on autopilot, because our life is not on autopilot. Our distractions are not on autopilot. It's always coming back to the present moment. And that's one of the reasons, not the main, that is the main reason why I made the free app, Practicing Presence the Christian Way, to cut through that resistance. And I really feel, from the feedback I've gotten, and using it myself, and me and my wife, and I really feel that that is a excellent solution to our own resistance, because it cuts right through, because it walks us right through the practice and makes it so easy to do with the walks us through, and it's a very, very pleasant, meditative music that just, I couldn't be happier with the outcome of the free app, because that is the biggest. obstacle to all of us is the resistance we put into it. Once we resist change, once we stop resisting change and we inner condition ourselves, I doubt very much if, as I said before, if we ever go back to the way we lived before, because holy mackerel, we've allowed God to stop our inner negativity, our inner negative dialogue to the point where it cannot penetrate our presence. Powerful.
Yeah, you write it. You bring to your book Vanita Hampton Wright. You identify as an author and practitioner of Ignatian spirituality. Outlines 4 ways we resist letting go of old habits and beliefs. First, letting go of old ways of coping with our problems can feel like failure. Second, if we give up existing ways of behaving and coping, if through the practice of presence we drop our judgments about who we are or aren't, what then? 3, we become comfortable and secure in what we know. And 4, to practice presence means we have to face reality, to look at our problems for what they are. And most of us would rather deny those problems exist. So concluding from that, you say we're never as stable or happy as we are when present to God's Spirit within us. We go from believing to knowing on our way to peace. And when we come down to it, when we end this program, we're probably going to believe that practicing presence sounds ridiculously simple.
True. Yes. I say to people, it is a very simple practice. And people have told me, and I'm doing this many years, it really just sounds like too easy, like too good to be true. And I tell them, I said, look, God loves each of us equally. God gives us access to his Spirit equally. That access has to be simple. It can't be just for the few. It can't be an esoteric message that only a few people can actually grasp and learn. It has to be everyone. What's easier than the breath with the intention of connecting with God's spiritual energy? Who can't do that or understand that? It's like Jesus, when they asked him, what is the greatest commandment? Right. And he says, well, the greatest commandment is love the Lord thy God with thy whole heart, thy whole soul, thy whole mind, thy whole strength. And he said, the second is like it. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. But then he says, which I think is so powerful, he says, all the prophets and the laws are contained in these 2 commandments. So if we ever want to say to ourselves, oh, am I following the Gospels right? Am I being a good Christian? Am I being a good person? Answer that question. Do you love God? Do you love your neighbor? It's real simple. No, and if you had 100 people, 100 people gets it, because it can't be simpler than that or more profound than that. And that's what presence is. It's the gift that God gave us. It's basically God hiding in plain sight.
In the chapter titled "The Courage to Stop Negative Thinking and Gossip," the awareness that we take our life situations and turn them into the problem. So what does it mean to stop negative thinking or gossip? How do we become the problem because we have made the problem personal? That happens to us so often. And you write that in essence, the biggest impediment to our peace of mind is our own thoughts. That there's a lot of things that we are addicted to, and one of them you suggest is that we are addicted to negative thinkers. So what I'm doing here is I'm really going to come back as I throw these things out at you. We're going to take a break in less than a minute, and so I don't want to get you started, but just trying to go over this particular part of your book, and you consider negative thinking to be a cancer, but that gossip, uh, in effect, reflects our own inner lives. And when we know something that other people don't know, it makes us feel special, or we simply want to entertain. And you also write that when I am present to God's Spirit within me, I am also fully present to those who are around me. So there's so much here that we can talk about whenever we come back. Our guest this evening is Jim Heaney. We're talking again about his book titled Choosing Presence: How to Access God's Peace and Release Fear, Anxiety, and Stress. Welcome back to Amplify. Just about 20 minutes, last segment of our program. It's been a fascinating conversation with Jim Heaney. We've been talking about his book, Choosing Presence: How to Access God's Peace and Release Fear, Anxiety, and Stress. And one of the last two chapters in the book, next to the last, is titled The Courage to Stop Negative Thinking and Gossip, the awareness that we take our life situations and turn them into problems. Jim, tell us a little bit about what is meant by thought chatter.
Well, thought chatter basically is unconsciousness. It's that compulsive thinking going on. I'll give you an example. At times, we wake up in the morning and our head is just exploding with thoughts. We're thinking about some problems we may have, some concerns we may have, fears we may have, how we feel about ourselves, how we feel about other people. See, what happens, though, is we just continue that compulsive, repetitive thinking all day long. All the thoughts that we have today, 95% of those thoughts we had the day before. It's like we're torturing ourselves because we don't have the awareness of how much inner negativity we're creating within ourselves through an unconscious state. And that really is the core of our problem of having a personal, intimate relationship with God. He's always here now. Problem is, we're not here now 95% of the time.
Why do you consider negative thinking to be a cancer?
Negative thinking, it's a cancer for this reason. When we say negative thinking in the book, we frame it also as gossip. And gossip is a cancer, whether it's in our home, a family, our business, in a church. It doesn't matter where it is. If we allow gossip, what happens is the entire atmosphere becomes negative. And one of the things in my company, I've written rules. Gossip is not tolerated. And quite frankly, if we had to let go of 10 people, probably half of them will let go because they couldn't stop gossiping. We don't accept it. I don't care how talented an employee may be. If you are hurting another person, you do not deserve to be in a company where gossip is absolutely not allowed.
Mm-hmm.
And over the years, it's probably one of the best decisions I made. I probably made it 25 years ago. And certainly in my own family. So the negative thinking, it all starts again in that unconscious mind because of all the inner negativity we created. So we have no space to love God and love each other if we're filled with anxiety and worry and nervousness and jealousy and envy. That there's no space.
Right.
It just doesn't work.
Let me just read a couple things in this chapter. I want to end talking about the final chapter. We all want peace. Um, you write, we get so focused on the readings and rituals of religion that we don't take time to encounter God in our lives. And you have a quote from Reverend Jim Burklow, who writes, we teach them doctrine and dogma for years, and then maybe possibly, if we get around to it, we teach them how to experience God. What we need to do is teach them to experience God first, and then that will make sense or nonsense of the doctrine and dogma. And it seems to me that these words ring so true right now. Well, so many people are going to church because of certainly out in California where you are, it's a real problem. The
Yes.
coronavirus, this might be, a time for us to people to understand, not just to know about God, but this is a time for them to know God with the great concern regarding racism in our country, and to be able to reflect on Psalm 46, be still and know that I am God, or you have a quote as Jesuit theologian Karl Rahner said, if we as Christians do not experience something, we will be nothing. Amplify
Yes.
wherever you'd like to in what I've just said.
Yeah. And I think that's so true and so necessary to take that to heart, is that so over the years, talking about presence, being in the jail ministry, people have come up to me and said, basically they've said, I know that I believe in God and I know he can change my life, but how do I actually access that? How do I do that? They're not saying how to do that. In our churches, unfortunately, we talk about presence a lot, and everything that they say is absolutely true. The only problem is we're not teaching access. Like you just said, it was actually Burko was talking, I believe, about Thomas Hand. He was a Jesuit who said that basically we're teaching them doctrine and dogma, but we have to teach them how to access God and then worry about the doctrine and the dogma. And that's what we're not doing. There was a book published, I believe it's called Intentional Discipleship, and it said basically that 50% or more of Catholics, Christians, don't believe it's possible to have a personal relationship with God. Well, if the only way God told us to have a personal relationship with him was through stillness, and we're not taught to bring in stillness, how does that actually happen?
Again, the title of the book is Choosing Presence. The final chapter is titled We All Want Peace. The practice of presence gets us there, that peace is available to us at all times. And peace is a choice. It's a choice of ours. Tell us a little bit, Jim, about the peace of which you speak. Like there is a difference between worldly peace and the peace of God.
I think the best way to talk about it is we know that we want to be happy. Okay, if someone asked me 25 or 30 years ago, "Are you happy?" I would have said, "Yeah, I'm absolutely. I believed I was." That was worldly happiness. Okay, but once I started practicing presence, I realized that happiness is shallow compared to peace. Okay, meaning that when we become still inside, and what happens to us, let's say we start a morning practice, there'll come a time during that morning practice where anything that we thought was so important and so urgent in our life just melts away. And the only thing that is important is the unmistakable calm and peace we feel inside as we become more still. And that's, I think, the best way to explain it. And we all experience it at some level in our life, but we don't experience it consistently enough to have confidence in it.
Worldly peace, you write, for the most part is mind-made, and it is temporary. God's peace is eternal, not because we're permanently calm and without conflicts in our life, but because God's peace is always there at the core of our vibrant inner life, available for us if we only allow ourselves to become aware of it. And then, you write, each of us is the treasure of God's spiritual energy. Here you're talking about the hidden treasure from Matthew 13:44. Each of us is that field, and buried within each of us is the treasure of God's spiritual energy. Every time you bring in stillness and connect with your vibrant inner life, God's spirit within you, you will experience then peace. Why do we resist peace? Peace.
We resist peace because peace is change. Even though we know it will make our life better, we resist change. It's really that simple. I'll give you a good example. Me and a good friend of mine who's a priest, we're talking about presence. And I could see he wasn't really like getting what I was saying. So I said, look, what I'd like you to do, as we're talking, just take some conscious breaths as you're listening, as we're talking back and forth. And, we continue to talk. And about 3 or 4 minutes into our conversation, he went, I got it. I got it.
Yes.
That's it.
Right.
If we practice presence with the right intention, it's as we become still, the experience of presence is unmistakable within us. We do not have to accept inner negativity. It simply is not real. It's created in a false state, an unconscious state outside the present moment.
Mm.
And you only really get it when you experience it.
Yes.
It's like Carl Radner, just like he said, if the new Christian doesn't experience something, he will be nothing.
Yes.
It's all God's power. That's what's so wonderful about it. I mean, we can talk confidently about presence because we're not doing anything except bring in stillness, and we all are capable of bringing in stillness, each and every one of us. And God is going to do the same for me, for you, for anyone who brings in stillness with that intention to connect with his spirit.
You're right. When we practice presence, we have moments of calm, serenity, and love that stop us in our tracks throughout the day and give us an instant change in our perspective of life now and how powerful the experience of God's spiritual energy really is. In John 14:27, Jesus tells us, I give you peace, the kind of peace that only I can give. It isn't like the peace that the world can give, so don't be worried or afraid. And then you write, why would we resist the very thing all of us want so badly in our lives? And that's a question I guess each of us needs to answer in some way, why we would do that. And you're right, when we are consciously present with the intention of connecting with God's peace inside and all around us, we find that there is little or no resistance because our ego energy has no power over us in the present moment. But we must have confidence in the practice to truly know that peace is available at all times.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Without the experience of it, we're not going to have confidence in it. And that really is the heart of it. The heart of presence is the experience of it. And it's by no means difficult. And as I said before, the app just cuts away so much of that resistance and makes it so easy for a person who wants to practice presence. Because
Right.
the app also reminds us every day when we use the app of why are we really doing this, okay? And what is our intention? And why is the intention so important? And it makes it just very easy for a person to practice presence.
And you want us to understand that happiness, which everyone's seeking to be happy, happiness is shallow compared to peace, which is a taste of the eternal within us.
Yes.
How then do we choose peace, especially if we understand that the kingdom of heaven is God's peace?
Yes. And it's within each of us
And there for
in this
us to
moment.
take, yes, and there to be discovered in so many ways. I could talk to you for a long time, lot longer. But the title of the book is Choosing Presence: How to Access God's Peace and Release Fear, Anxiety, and Stress, by Jim Heaney, Heaney. Thank you so very much for spending this time with us tonight. You're a wonderful teacher, and the fact that you uh, practice presence yourself, I think, after we understand what it is, we become immediately aware of the fact that that's something that you must be practicing, and hopefully it's something we will want to do also. So thank you very much, and hope we get a chance to talk more in the future.
Absolutely. Thank you, Father Ron.